but we are recording this and it will be part of our long-term history with AAMC, so we want to make that as accessible as possible. So I'll tell you about the AAMC Foundation Engagement Program for International Curators, just a little bit about AAMC, and then the topic of our webinar today. Then I will briefly, very briefly, introduce our two speakers today, Heather MacDonald and Georgiana Uhlyarik. I've never pronounced your last name. Did I do okay?
Very well.
Okay, all right. And they will say a brief, they'll talk for about 8 to 10 minutes about a question we prepared in advance. Then we'll open it up to our mentees, and you will type your question into the sidebar, and I will ask our esteemed panelists, and I won't be sharing your name just because that's the way the webinars work. So the AAMC Foundation Engagement Program for International Curators. So I think we're all thrilled that we're part of this first group. It's for 3 non-US based curators and 3 US liaisons. So for the US liaisons, we're part of the program for a year. For the international members, it's a 2-year program. And the project is to work on exhibitions and projects that explore historic American art circa 1500 to 1980. And the goals of the program is to foster international relationships between curators and provide opportunities for professional development and exchange, expanding and strengthening international curatorial communities, and giving primacy to the curatorial voice in international dialogue between museums. And I think this is really exciting. I have already had that experience just working on this seminar, just talking with Georgiana yesterday, and of course working with my mentee. It's been fantastic. Something about AAMC. We were founded in 2001, and we celebrate curators by supporting and promoting their work at all levels of their career and all kinds of institutions. AAMC aims to be a voice for all curators, regardless of field, experience level, and institutional type. And we ensure that the curatorial perspective on art, museums, and educational issues is actively communicated to the public, media, and museum profession. Today, we have over 1,300 members and over 400 institutions around the globe. And one of the things that I think is really exciting about AAMC is that next year we're having our first international conference in my hometown of Montreal. So we're going to Canada, which is just great and continues this dialogue that the Terra Foundation has helped support of curators working across international borders. So today our panelists have been asked some specific questions, but more generally to think about globalism and its impact on curatorial practice, and in particular, how ideas of local versus international are framed in exhibitions and collections. And I think this takes on various different permutations in different countries and different curatorial approaches and different curatorial fields. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists about how they think about that question, as well as how it relates to specific projects or communities that they've been working with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just introduce Heather and Georgiana briefly. And while you're listening to them speak, if you think of any specific questions, mentees, you can type them in and they'll sort of queue up on the side so that I have them ready to go when Heather and Georgiana have stopped speaking. So a little bit about Heather. Heather MacDonald is Senior Program Officer at the Getty Foundation, where she's responsible for grant making related to advancing museum scholarship and education, and including the really remarkable Pacific Standard Time LALA project. And before joining the Getty in 2015, she was an associate curator of European art at the Dallas Museum of Art, where she spent nearly 10 years. And she began her career at the Huntington Library Botanical Gardens, which is a wonderful institution, if any of you haven't been there. She received her PhD from University of California, Berkeley. And Georgiana is Associate Curator of Canadian Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Toronto. And her recent curatorial projects, I realized this as I was looking, she has had a big year in 2017. International collaborations, Georgia O'Keeffe, 2017 with Tate Modern London and the Austria Kunstforum in Vienna, as well as Florine Stettheimer, Painting Poetry, 2017 at the Jewish Museum. And PAFA was a happy lender to that show. She also worked on Picturing the Americas, landscape painting with Tierra del Fuego, which is one of the projects that we asked her to think about as she was talking today. Among her curatorial collaborations at the AGO are Rita Letendre, Fire and Light, Introducing Susie Lake, The Passion of Kathleen Munn, and Betty Goodwin. I see a wonderful women's work theme emerging here. She participated in International Research Network Exploring Feminism and Curating, and she received her honors BA from the University of Toronto and her MA in Art History from York University, where she's also adjunct faculty. She lives in Toronto with her sons. And for everyone who may not have met me, I'm Anna Marley. I'm curator of historical American art at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts and director for the Center of the Study of the American Artist. That is a brand new research and works on paper facility that we received NEH funding for a few years ago. So I encourage you all to come see it when you visit the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. So I think I will get Heather started with some thinking of presenting her thoughts based on some of the questions we sent in advance and the theme of this webinar. Heather.
Okay, well, I was invited to participate primarily to talk about our work here at the Getty Foundation on Pacific Standard Time, LA, but I should probably back up and start with a little bit of an introduction of what is Pacific Standard Time. I don't want to assume that people know, that history, which if you didn't, if we're not here in Los Angeles in 2010 or 11, it might have not crossed your path. This is the second iteration of a very, very large initiative that the Getty Foundation has funded, but has really been working in close partnership with every part of the Getty and a lot of other partners throughout Los Angeles and Southern California. The first iteration in 2010 was focused on art in LA, art made in California, particularly in Southern California and Los Angeles during the post-war years, 1945 to 1980. And this resulted in more than 60 exhibitions, about 68 exhibitions, more than 40 scholarly catalogs that really explored in a way that had never been attempted before with like a depth and a breadth the art that had been made in Southern California during this post-war period. When that initiative was drawing to a close as the exhibitions were wrapping up, there was a really strong desire on the part of the partners we had worked with, the museums and arts organizations throughout Southern California, that the collaboration continue. I think everyone felt that it was a really positive experience professionally, institutionally, and for the region, for our audiences. And so there was a very strong impetus to continue collaborating and to think about what another iteration of Pacific Standard Time could be. And interestingly, the question sort of that was sent to me was sort of how did the Getty arrive at choosing the focus of this Pacific Standard Time, which is the dialogue between Latin American and Latino art and Los Angeles. And the fact is, it wasn't the Getty that selected it. It was really a shared decision that came through a very collaborative process that involved the Getty's various programs, not only the Getty Museum and of course the Getty Foundation, but also the Research Institute, the Conservation Institute, and then with some of our key planning partners from throughout Southern California, including the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Chicano Studies Research Center at UCLA, the Hammer Museum. And it was through conversation and sort of exploring what possibilities were out there that it emerged, I think, very strongly for everyone in those discussions that turning the attention of this initiative to Latin American, Latino, and Chicano art would be very timely, very important for the institutions and our audiences. And so it really was a shared decision that that emerged quite quickly after the finish of our first Pacific Standard Time initiative. We then started to work with our partners on making our initial research grants starting in 2013. So many of these projects that are launching this fall, some of them this month, and with the main opening next month, have been in the works for some time. These have been long-term research projects by many of these institutions surrounding this very broad and open topic, this question that was posed when we launched this, these grants to say, for asking institutions to bring us the project that was meaningful for their institution, for their curatorial team, that was relevant to their own mission, looking at, again, this extremely sort of broad sort of field of artistic activity. And so from the beginning, this has not been something that's been dictated sort of from the Getty outward to our partners. It's been very collaborative, and each of the, at this point, we have more than 50 grantee organizations presenting exhibitions, programming series, film series, and so on this fall. Each of them brought us the project that was meaningful to them, that was generated by their own curators, by curators that they invited to participate with them in this initiative. And so there's a very interesting broad range of artists, kinds of art, historical periods that will be on view. But I think that it's really important to see this as something that grew from our partner institutions in a very sort of organic way, even as there was leadership from the Getty and some of our planning partners on sort of setting a topic to respond to at the beginning of the process. And I think the other question that I was asked to speak of is, a little bit, was there concern or discussion in this early stage about the possibility that these projects would be led sort of by definition by Southern California institutions or Southern California-based curators, and would that allow for a sufficient, I think, dialogue or input from curators based in Latin America? And the fact is that was, obviously really important to us at the Getty Foundation as a funder, and was really part of how we structured the grants that we made, particularly in the research phase. As I said, that began for us in 2013 and 14, and has continued as we supported these research projects, in many cases, not only allowing curators based in Southern California to do very extensive international research, often stretching over a couple of years, but also to form advisory committees and to partner with peers, curators based throughout Latin America. And there have been some very interesting partnerships that developed, I think, because there was that possibility for travel, for bringing these collaborating curators to Southern California for our convenings that were hosted here at the Getty, and for other sort of working meetings of each individual museum's advisory committees. So in the end, there are some projects that are co-organizations with museums in Latin America. There are many exhibition projects that are co-curated by a Southern California-based curator with a curator based in Latin America. And I'd say that the vast majority of the projects include advisors, contributors to the catalog, and so on, based in sort of relevant locations throughout Latin America. So I think that was part of our thinking in terms of how we structured our grants, was to make sure that there was that opportunity for a really deep institutional and curatorial connections sort of being forged to peer organizations and peer curators in Latin American countries as well, so that it isn't simply relying on the kind of curatorial pool based in Southern California, although that is a very rich and diverse and obviously very well-equipped group of individuals to lead a lot of these projects. But each project was highly collaborative and very international.
Great. Well, I think maybe we'll let Georgiana talk, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thanks for that, Heather.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, and thank you, AAMC, for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I think what I will do for the sort of 8 to 10 minutes that I have is really focus on one project as a kind of case study, is the project that Anna mentioned, Picturing the Americas, from Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic. Because I think it makes sense to me, because it'll open up, I think, at least I hope, 2 areas of investigation. One that addresses content or subject matter, and the other one is sort of the nature of curatorial collaboration and models for partnership. And that will sort of be at the very end, and hopefully that's where the conversation can really take place. But before I start, I would like to give a little bit of context in these 2 areas, one that has to do with the Art Gallery of Ontario, and the second in specific with the content regarding Picturing the Americas. Simply because we are from Canada, I thought I can't assume that everybody knows, just like Heather was talking about, that not everyone can seem to know everything about Pacific Standard Time. So the Art Gallery of Ontario is a major art museum in Toronto, along with the National Gallery of Canada. We are probably the leading art museum in Canada. And Toronto has always been sort of, economically rather thriving, and a very diverse and multicultural city. And so the institution, which is over 100 years old, that has a broad collection of European, medieval, contemporary, it has a real focus on collecting Canadian art, or art from Canada, along with Inuit art, and more recently, Indigenous art. In 2008, we had a major transformation with Frank Gehry, who's redesigned a major part of our building, along with a new center. And I mentioned this because I realized it's been almost a decade ago, and that's when we really began to think about or rethink about art in Canada. You know, how is it that we deal with this material? How is it that we present this material? Really, for the very first time, I would say the institution really began to think more broadly about how it is that we deal with this material. And working in this department, for me, this became a kind of leading area of investigation. And I will say just a little bit about Canada as well, and in terms of its nation form, because we are right now, this year in particular, it is 150 years since Canada became a dominion. It continues to be very much like Australia, a constitutional monarchy and a representative democracy. But one of the things about Canada is that it seems to be going through kind of this perpetual identity crisis, which in some ways it can be a very sort of productive and open thing. It doesn't mean that there is not a sort of dominant cultural settler legacy. It's just that it's rather fragmented, and simply to think about, for example, the difference between culture in Quebec versus culture in Ontario and then on the Northwest Coast, already there cannot be sort of a single canon against which we can either rebel or make work against. So you know, this offers some great opportunities, but also this means that in terms of dealing with rethinking questions of art history, sometimes it's sort of tricky to locate exactly which art history we're dealing with. And the other thing about, I would say, because I think it's rather important to think about in terms of the project and the work that I do, is that Canadian art history in many ways is the history of exhibitions of Canadian art. So instead of there being kind of a textbook or a book, you know, sort of the tome, it really is a series of publications over time that have been put together. So again, there isn't a kind of centralized place, but rather a series of sort of ongoing thinking about whether it's painting or whether it's a particular artist. I would say that in terms of what is sort of a dominant cultural legacy when it comes to art in Canada, I think we are talking about the modern period. We're talking about artists associated with the Group of Seven: Tom Thompson, Emily Carr, David Milne. If there is something that one might expect to think about what is art in Canada, I think most people will go to these artists. Although, as you can already tell, none of these are from Quebec. So, you know, Quebec is a whole other area. So again, it's complicated. Of course, it's complicated. So when thinking about the Art Gallery of Ontario and art in Canada and what is the role, this, as I said, became kind of the central question for me. What is it that the Canadian Art Department, to do the curators in this area, can do in dealing with this material, both at home or sort of, you know, in our own institution, but also abroad beyond.
Georgiana, you froze a little bit. Judith, do you know how you can help
focus on the issue is, and this I will reveal a little bit of a chip on my shoulder that I have, and I think most Canadian Canadian curators have this issue. Oh, have I disappeared?
We can still hear you.
Have I disappeared? Do you know?
But your camera was frozen.
Okay, okay, I just can't.
So.
Okay.
No. Let's see if it.
Oh, you're back.
Yes. Okay. Talk about the chip on your shoulder.
Exactly. Just at that time, maybe it's a sign that I really should not be revealing this, but I will nonetheless. And as I said, this has to do with, how, for me, it is a question of how is it that we can talk about art made in Canada, cultural production in Canada, and it be part of a cross-cultural dialogue. And the chip on the shoulder has to do with the fact that I think that if we were to think in this kind of binary of center and periphery, which may or may not be helpful, because I think that in this binary, the perspective is always still from the center. But for the chip on the shoulder situation, it's helpful because I think that art in Canada, at least from the outside, is still perceived as sort of being sort of from the provinces. It's neither exotic enough to really represent the other, and it's neither sort of exceptional enough according to these other standards from the center in order to warrant attention. And I would say that perhaps most often it is simply invisible. So outside of Canada. So, to me, this is something that sort of really is at the center of the responsibility of the Art Gallery of Ontario's curatorial department that is dealing with art in Canada, is how is it that we can actually be part of a broader conversation that actually can be transformative rather than simply, simply belong as well, if you know what I mean. So Picturing the Americas truly was an amazing opportunity to really sort of take this head on, and a little bit of background about that. And I think very much to what Heather was talking about, I think there are some key things even before you get started that make this successful, and that is to really have the time and the resources to really be able to make this a research project for it to be really transformative. So Picturing the Americas was a 5-year project in the making. It was led by the Terra Foundation for American Art, whom I cannot thank enough for making all of this possible. You really do need funders and partners who are willing to commit both time and funds to make something like this possible. It was, like I said, between the Terra Foundation, PJ Brownlee, the curator, and Valeria Piccoli from the Pinacoteca in Sao Paulo, and then our venue in the United States at Crystal Bridges. And what we wanted to do when we got together was really to take familiar material, and this is landscape painting, perhaps almost material that was kind of too familiar, and try to offer or propose a new lens of framework through which to examine it. And so we thought that, in fact, as we began our research, we realized that this has never happened before, that most often this kind of material is looked at either in sort of a compare and contrast between two nations, if it ever gets transnational, let's say, or it's simply within the nation itself looking at its own tradition. So by creating this hemispheric lens or this hemispheric perspective, we were able to, at least I hope, begin to ask new questions of this tradition and also of our art history. And for me, this was really key, is sort of how is it that we can deal with this material in a new way so we can open up new areas of investigation and conversations. So, you know, in many ways, it was a very simple thing that we did. We brought artists and art together that truly had never been thought of together, seen together, examined together, researched together. And in and of itself, we hoped, and I hope that we succeeded in some way, made something kind of new open up. You know, so as an example would be to bring, you know, Tarsila Damaral from Brazil together with Georgia O'Keeffe from the United States and Lauren Harris from Canada and Dr. Adel from Mexico, truly bring them together in one room and kind of try to understand what happens. In addition to that, I think very importantly, not only bring these works together that have never been together, but also critically move them across the hemisphere. So to understand actually how this exhibition has a different kind of flavor, if you like. I cannot think of any different word. That seems like the wrong word. In Toronto, it has sort of it has a different feel than it had in Bentonville than it had in Sao Paulo. And for me, it really is the totality of having had this experience in these three different cities with these works that really generated this new conversation that we were interested in having. Because our goal, again, fundamentally was to have a cross-cultural conversation that dealt with looking at the way in which we are connected across the hemisphere and the way in which we are distinct. And I think we try to always keep it rather simple in this way. The gesture was simple, the question was simple, so that it really felt like we were at the beginning of something. In sort of questions and conversations I had in preparation for this webinar, there was this question of like, what about this material? What about this historical landscape painting? You know, and I think that when we came together, you know, the Terra and Pinacoteca and the AGO, among many, many institutions, I think we're all at this moment where we're trying to figure out how to deal with this settler imagination, how to deal with the settler legacy, how to deal with this material that in many ways continues to permeate sort of the symbolic core of these nations in one way or another. Because I do fundamentally believe that we cannot ignore these works. I think within them they hold ideas and ideals that from the 19th century that continue to really be dominant in the way in which we all live our lives, the way in which our governments are formed, the way in which society acts, especially in dealing with issues such as the environment, resources, and very importantly, Indigenous issues. So to me, this is not material we can ignore, but rather, very importantly, I wanted to think through how is it that we can present it so that we can actually reveal that it is not background, that it is not simply there and like, oh, look, it's just a pretty picture of a hill or a road or a sunset, but rather that these are deeply held values that continue to affect the way in which we live our lives. And the last thing that I'm going to say, it has to do with process. And again, I so very much like listening to Heather mentioning this desire for collaboration and what is true collaboration and what is meaningful collaboration. And also very importantly, how the projects have to be deeply connected to the work of the art museum in this moment and what the mission and what the museum is trying to do. So I will say that for me, and I do think that for PJ and Valeria as well, and hopefully Fernanda can attest anonymously, that it really has been a transformative experience, that I think that our institutions have changed because of the way in which the project dealt with the material, and I think our practice has changed because we can never sort of go back to the way in which we were thinking about before. I would say that the most important thing for me from the project was that it not only broadened my perspective and understanding of this tradition across the hemisphere and also the development of modernity across the hemisphere, but also transformed the way in which I see art in Canada and these artists that in fact had become so familiar and in some way perhaps even stereotypical. They were in a way kind of re-energized for me to understand again what the profound legacy is, the consequence like of their art and legacy. So I think I will stop there, although I will say just at the very end, if people are more interested in Picturing the Americas, you can go to picturingtheamericas.org and find out lots more.
Thank you, Georgiana. That was fantastic. Okay, so we have about 24 minutes left for our discussion, which is great. We wanted to have more than 20 minutes. And I already have one question here. So this question is for Heather. And the question is, how was PST thinking about the possibility of expanding the initiative to maybe have venues or other projects in Latin America, spreading to Latin America local context, the research and knowledge produced collaboratively for the exhibitions and other activities in PST?
Right, that's a really important question. And I think that, as I mentioned, there are a few projects that are true core organizations with museums in Latin America, and that after their presentation this fall in Southern California will travel on and be presented in Buenos Aires, in Lima, Peru, in Mexico City. So we know that there will be, that kind of first level of opportunity, let's say, to experience the scholarship that was brought together in those exhibitions. I think that there's less than maybe we would have liked or imagined at the beginning of the initiative, and I think part of that has to do with the much more challenging economic climate in Latin America today than when we began work on this, in 2013 and 14. It was a different moment, and I think that institutions that in Latin America that would have been very interested in hosting some of these projects, in the end, it was just not financially possible. And I think that that's, kind of a reflection again of, real economic challenges. And, this is something that's familiar to curators and museum professionals, and is maybe beyond the limits of what we could achieve within the limit, within the structure of this grant initiative. We supported these projects with over $16 million in grants between the research grants and the implementation grants. And that certainly allowed for the creation of very ambitious research projects, major exhibitions, but did not it did not extend to supporting the costs of traveling the exhibitions in Latin America. So again, I think some will be traveling. I think some people are still kind of working out details of their travel, their venues, and so I think that we'll be hearing about other projects that will also travel. However, I think we always knew from the outset that the real legacy and the real way that this research and scholarship would sort of have its fullest impact was through the scholarly catalogs. And so that's been a really important part of our funding. For the first Pacific Standard Time initiative focused on art in Los Angeles, at the beginning, when the Getty started working with our partners on this, there was literally one monographic, scholarly monographic book about West Coast art in the post-war period. Because of Pacific Standard Time, that created more than 40 scholarly catalogs on this topic. And of course, since then, the interest has continued to expand. And many of these artists that I think were rediscovered by audiences and art historians at that moment have continued to receive attention in exhibitions and other kinds of scholarship. In this case, with Pacific Standard Time LA, we are operating on a slightly even larger scale. We will have nearly 50 scholarly catalogs published as a result of this initiative. And that will also, be really important to the ability for a much, much wider audience beyond our Southern California audiences to really, I think, respond to in a scholarly way, what the curators of these projects are trying to achieve. So that's been an important part of our grant making strategies, is to make sure that those catalogs are a really important priority for each institution. And I think that one of the things that's very gratifying to me in this work is that for some of our partner institutions, these are not maybe museums that are have had a long practice of producing scholarly catalogs. Many of them rarely produce catalogs for their exhibitions in general. And so I think for lots of them, that was a big, like a heavy lift. And through the grant making, they were able to produce, I think, a vehicle for their scholarship that maybe has been lacking for past projects. And I think that's been really important to see these catalogs, and which are now actually starting to arrive in our offices as these exhibitions are beginning to open across Southern California. I think we have, believe 4 have now actually sort of had their soft opening to the public, even as the sort of grand openings will happen next month. And as we start to see these catalogs come in, I feel like that's where you see the real legacy. I think that, one of the challenges that we spent a lot of time talking about with partners, in terms of, even as they were applying for funding, was should these catalogs be bilingual, which is a huge challenge for publishing budgets, and not just logistically, but in terms of, the wish of distributors. There's lots of issues with distribution once you go for a bilingual catalog. And so that, I think that that's a very, it's a complicated question. And we, as a funder, were agnostic and sort of told each of our grantee partner organizations, like, that is a choice that each institution had to make for themselves. And some of the museums went back and forth, started saying, absolutely, we'll have a bilingual catalog. In the end, we're not, chose not to proceed with that route, but are pursuing other mechanisms to make sure that the scholarship is accessible to the widest possible audience. For instance, I know that one of our partners, the University Art Museum at Cal State Long Beach, they're producing a really wonderful exhibition about the Argentinian artist David Lamelas that they're doing as a co-organization with Malba, and they are choosing to produce 2 separate catalogs because they want the translation to be by an Argentinian translator for an Argentinian audience, not a sort of generic, Spanish language for a broad Latin American public, but really thinking about the public at Malba, who have a real strong interest in this artist and want something that's really directed to them. And so in the end, there'll be a second edition of the catalog that the exhibition opens in Buenos Aires in spring 2018. So there's been many different solutions, but I think we definitely are committed to the idea of publishing this scholarship as the most enduring and important means of, really diffusing the research that happened. And I think in many cases, the research that's taken place for these exhibitions is quite unique, quite different than maybe what it would have happened in a different context. And I think a little bit echoing, what Georgiana was saying is the fact of bringing together artists and modes of art making that maybe historically have not been brought together in exhibition context does, certainly change the conversation. And that's been, certainly we have exhibitions, many exhibitions that will take part of Pacific Standard Time LA this fall that are showing Latin American art together with art made by Latino and Chicano artists. And that is not something that has happened a great deal in American museums or in museums throughout Latin America. And so I think that is, I think that has the potential to really shift scholarship and shift scholarly conversations as these catalogs become part of the art historical discourse. And hopefully that will be a very long-lasting and enduring impact well beyond the moment when the exhibitions have closed in Southern California, which will be in most cases sort of end of this year into early 2018, and even beyond when they conclude their presentations in Latin American cities, in 2018 and potentially even into 2019.
Thank you, Heather. That was amazing. I want to quote you to my board about the real legacy of shows being cataloged. I have a question for Georgiana now. Georgiana, wonderful to hear about the project. Can you touch on the curatorial discussions around whether and how First Nations artists might figure in the exhibition?
Right, and so this was perhaps the question and the issue that we tackled from the beginning to the end, and I don't think that there are any definitive sort of answers to it, but I can talk to the way in which we decided to deal with this material. So in Canada in particular, for I would say decades now, it is not possible to deal with historical landscape painting or historical paintings really from the 19th century and well into the 20th century without thinking about Indigenous people, the history of the colony of Canada and so on. So there have been many different ways in which exhibitions have dealt with this material before, and we started to think about and explored a number of different ways in which to think about it. And I think the one that had been traditionally and sort of continues to be a way in which these two perspectives or these two different cultural traditions are brought together, settler and Indigenous, is to bring material that is contemporary. So in other words, look at the paintings that were made, let's say in the mid-19th century, with material from Anishinaabe culture or Haida culture from mid-19th century as well. And, for example, right now, the National Gallery of Canada has recently reopened their permanent collection. And this is in many ways the way that they have approached dealing with this material, as well as including a lot of contemporary Indigenous art within the historical collections. And this is something that we thought about, and we talked to both Indigenous artists and Indigenous scholars. And, one of the things that I think made this partnership and this collaboration really fruitful is the fact that we invited as many people as possible to talk to us as often as possible in order to make sure that we really were opening sort of a big conversation. And I think in the end, in this moment, what we decided was that it was much more important to have the presence of very contemporary Indigenous thinkers and scholars and artists be present in the exhibition very much as sort of living, self-determined, self-possessed voices, rather than sort of objects that are inevitably aestheticized when they are placed in the art museum in a case. So for us, at least in Toronto, this was truly critical for us, and the way in which the presentation at the AGO focused that conversation, in terms of Indigenous issues and this historical material from the 19th century, was to think about this place, because it was, for me, it was very important to really focus it in the very local, and to think about Toronto and what are the Indigenous cultures that have always been the keepers of this land and continue to do so, despite sort of the history that has taken place. And as an example, as you exited the exhibition, so still within the exhibition space, I had brought the treaty that deals with the city of Toronto. And so this is the actual document from Library and Archives Canada, and I wanted all of our visitors to leave understanding that there is this document that in and of itself is a description of the land, is a description of the landscape that really determines how all of us live to this day. And invite Indigenous scholars and thinkers and artists to comment on this. And all of this material is available online on the AGO website, where you have people like Shelley Nero, who's an artist who speaks directly to this experience of the land. And I think from a kind of, from knowing that the majority of the people who are going to come and see the exhibition, were going to be settlers or immigrants or tourists, to really kind of reaffirm that there exists this treaty, and that we need to be in these very difficult and uncomfortable conversations in order to understand what the legacy is and what the reality is, and the frame through which we can look at all this material that they can see sort of on a regular basis when they come to the AGO. And it was very satisfying, I will say, for me, that because of the ongoing conversations that we had, Crystal Bridges also, I think for the very first time, reached out to the reserve near Bentonville, Arkansas, and they worked with Indigenous leaders and had extended labels that spoke to the works that were on view. And I think also in Brazil, there was a kind of, it's very different in Brazil, and I won't speak to that since I'm not necessarily incredibly familiar with it, but for the very first time, I think there was a kind of different conversation regarding Indigenous issues and this historical material in Sao Paulo. So for me, this is one of the ways in which the exhibition was transformative for everyone.
Georgiana, I just want to ask you a follow-up question. How did you get all those voices in the exhibition space? Bringing the treaty, and then actually, how did you activate that space curatorially?
Right. So at the Art Gallery of Ontario, the team that works on a project includes a number of key people, and one of them is an interpretive planner. The other one is the exhibition designer. So the three of us really work very closely together from the beginning to create sort of what we refer to as a visitor experience. Mm-hmm. And it was really critical that PJ and Valeria were part of these conversations, so that I was not the only curator, but it was always the curatorial team working together with the interpretive planner and the exhibition designer. So there, in some ways, the simplest ways, they are the best ways. So as soon as you entered the exhibition, there was a screen, and you had 3 different perspectives speaking to the material and to the idea of the exhibition. What is landscape painting? What is the land? What would be a hemispheric perspective? And what is the history of this place? And right away, having 3 different perspectives meant that there was not sort of one way or one lens through which to look at this work. And so that happened. And there were also sort of quotes within the exhibition itself. There were sort of scholars that were commenting on the material, and they were kind of this overall overarching commentary, specifically in certain thematic areas that really needed it. And then, like I said, that area that dealt with the treaty had, again, new voices, new Indigenous voices speaking again to the history specifically of this land, of Toronto in particular.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more brief question because it's 5:54. And so, Heather, there's a question for you. How did you identify partners to fund? Was there a call for proposals?
Yes, there was. And in this case, it's maybe sort of an easy thing to identify because our call was open to any museum or nonprofit arts organization in Southern California, which for us was from the border, San Diego, to Santa Barbara and sort of out to Palm Springs, was sort of how we drew the definition of sort of Southern California museums. And within that, as I said, we had an open call, for institutions to bring the project that was meaningful to them. And then there was a external peer review committee that reviewed the proposals. And as generally we do, we worked very closely with each of these applicants to, really make sure that, that the proposal was, very strong. And we had a lot of outreach in the form of sort of different kinds of convenings. And certainly, once the first grants were made, we instantly began setting up this sort of series of convenings, workshops, different ways to really sort of build the collaborative structure and offer a lot of the support to connect institutions that maybe didn't have historically strong ties to peer organizations in Latin America, and to really use the Getty Foundation's more than 20 years of very extensive work in Latin America to connect them to expertise, to scholars that, could really aid their projects. So that, that process began even before applications were submitted, as we were having these initial conversations with organizations and museums in Southern California, and it continues, to this day as the exhibitions are getting ready to open, and we still, are having really interesting conversations with many of our grantees, about as the programming's emerging, as they're sort of getting ready for their opening events. I mean, it's definitely very gratifying to have that depth of involvement that we're very privileged to have as funders with the neighborhoods in our own backyard. These are our our closest partners, are the organizations that are not just geographically, but in many ways, really close to the heart of the Getty and part of this extended Museum of Southern California. And so, we definitely invest a lot in those relationships, and I think that historically that's worked really well over these past two Pacific Standard Time initiatives.
Well, thank you, Heather. That's a great response. I think now we all need to head out to LA together and
Please,
have
yes.
a cup of coffee at the Getty and go see some shows together.
We're going to have more than 70 exhibitions on view this fall. And so, yeah, absolutely. We hope that lots of people will make the trip.
Well, I'm hoping to be able to come myself. So I want to thank Heather and Georgiana for being our amazing panelists today, and to our mentees for their great questions, and to AAMC for giving us all this opportunity. I think it was a great webinar. I certainly took a lot of notes and learned a lot myself. So thank you, Heather and Georgiana.
Thank you, Anna.
Okay. All right. Bye. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.